Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here this evening. It's always my honor to be here. Um, I like to think of what we're doing here as kind of fortifying our ships so that they can set sail. And I always often when I'm introducing myself, and of course, Aideen has given me a lovely introduction, so I won't bore you with all this other stuff on the left. But those are my professional hats, and I've worked in a lot of different capacities across the island of Ireland. But my most important job, I often say, is that of being a parent. And these three kids on the right, those are mine, and I feel many times like they are, my most useful teachers of what is most important to me in the world or out there in the world. So before we really get stuck in, let me ask you, my reason for doing a lot of the work that I do is my own kids, but there are lots of different ways of knowing things. And, we don't have a lot of time together tonight, but if people are willing, I would love to see if you can connect, if all of us can connect together with whatever your intention might be for this short bit of time that we have together. So with your head, see if you can connect to something that you might like to learn. With your hands, that's another way of learning things. See if you can connect with something that you want to be able to do by the end of this time we have together. And finally, with our heart, your hearts, is there something that you might want personally from tonight? So see if you can connect with your head, your hands, and your heart with whatever your intentions might be for this evening. So you can write those things down if you like, or maybe you just want to hold them in your mind as we go through this bit of time together. So I'm going to be talking to you this evening from the perspective of acceptance and commitment therapy, or for short, we just call it ACT. And ACT is about accepting what is here right now, connecting to what matters to you, and taking steps in the direction of whatever's important to you. So sometimes that might be being the person you want to be in the world. And if you can do those three things, and the more you do those three things, that builds what's called psychological flexibility. So everything that I'm going to talk to you about tonight, it applies to all of us as human beings. It applies to us as parents in the ways, I like to think of like, how do I want to parent? How do I want to support my child to be the best version of themselves? And essentially, we're always modeling this, whether we like it or not. We're often, the key model for our children in them deciding how do they want to go forward in the world. And so what I want to advocate for here is, let's show them how it's done. And of course, you often hear things like, do as I say, not as I do. But I often think that parenting itself is an incredibly difficult task. But importantly, it's also a developmental task. And what I mean by that is that the skills that we had or the skills that we learned when our babies were tiny, those are a completely different set of skills to those that we need for supporting our kids, through secondary school, to the end of that, to university, if that's where they're going, and through emerging adulthood. So it's really important for us to think about, our kids are growing and changing, but how are we growing and changing and amending and adapting our skills so that we can support our kids through all of life's transitions? And often during moments of high stress, like these important exams, years, or really any of our parenting moments, the good ones, the bad ones, the ugly ones, our key job often includes trying to protect our children from all of the dangers in the world. But the thing is, there are so many different types of danger in the world. And that can be incredibly overwhelming, even just to pause long enough to try to figure out, how do I even begin to support my teenager in the modern world? And I also think, for a lot of us, doesn't even feel like I have got time to pause. And I suspect I'm not unique in that. And the other thing I find, across my years of parenting, you're kind of getting advice from everybody. But who are we supposed to listen to? And I find increasingly, there are a lot of really valuable resources at the school, whether that's in the person of a school guidance counselor or, regular teachers or somebody from the, special ed support team. We often get a lot of advice from other parents, sometimes the media, perhaps from psychologists. We all got a lot of, sorry, I'm speaking for myself. I got a lot of advice from my own parents. Maybe you do too. Sometimes we might take heed of, let's say, other students who've been there and done that. Maybe some of us are getting information from all of the above, none of the above. And one thing that I find is fairly universal, no matter how great the advice is, many times our teenagers don't want to hear it. My husband has a great phrase, a prophet is never recognized in his own land. And, sometimes even with all of this advice at our fingertips, sometimes we don't want it, sometimes they don't want it, and sometimes this is terribly overwhelming. So I've pulled together just a few helpful websites, sources of practical tips. And, you can take a photo of that if you like. But also this is being recorded too. I can share these later, Olive and Nadine, if people haven't managed to get them down. But I feel like we could spend hours and hours just pouring through all of those. And there's a lot of wisdom out there, even just to curate it and see, like, who am I supposed to be listening to? I think that in and of itself can be overwhelming. But there's a few websites here that I've pulled together just so we can add that to whatever wisdom your school guidance team might have to offer you. And all that aside, I'm going to start off by scaring you a little bit. I'm sorry, I mean telling you about the clinical research. So current rates of anxiety in both children and adolescents are extremely high. In Ireland, 22% of adolescents, so those between the ages of 12 and 18, have reported severe anxiety levels, while 26% of young adults fall into the severe and very severe categories for anxiety. In the States, 10% of children between the ages of 3 and 17 have been diagnosed with anxiety, and that's clinical anxiety. Worldwide, anxiety is the 9th leading cause of disease and illness for 15 to 19-year-olds, and it's the 6th leading problem for those in the age ranges of 10 through 14. Research also estimates that the prevalence of clinically elevated child and adolescent anxiety are a stark 20.5% of the global population. In Ireland, we know that about 1 in 12 children ages 11 to 13 experience anxiety, and between 1 and 20 experience social phobia and, clinically diagnosed generalized anxiety disorder. So when we're looking at children and adolescents, this can involve all sorts of what I would often, many parents would talk about, this is just so difficult, the behavioral responses that a child or an adolescent puts forward during these times. Sometimes it is something like phobia. Other times it might be just this kind of sense of fearfulness. Maybe it is separation anxiety from parents. Maybe it's self-consciousness. Some parents report this kind of intense worrying that maybe they really haven't seen before. And maybe that's accompanied by all sorts of irrational thinking. And something that I think is really important to be aware of is that teenagers have vastly more complicated lives now than they did even 5 or 10 years ago. So no matter what country we're in, no matter what age group we're looking at, anxiety is a very serious problem right now. And understandably, even talking about this, looking at all these statistics and the research that's been done, this can be really anxiety provoking for parents. We're often trying to support our kids and doing our best. And sometimes it feels like we're, like fighting with the whole world. And I think it's just an incredibly difficult job. And there are a lot of factors for teenagers that contribute to this, increase in stress and anxiety. And, we're talking about, sort of exam stress now, but there's also just general performance. A lot of us feel like we're constantly on, we're constantly being watched, we're constantly being checked or graded or marked. Of course, relationships, hormones, don't forget all that. Difficult parents, not any of you, of course. Difficult teachers, no, not here. Difficult systems to navigate. Have any of you looked at the CAO process or the DARE scheme right now? You need a PhD in some sort of systems management, even just to figure out how do we get through this process? And there's a lot of stress in the larger world out there. And, all of this is happening at a time when, teenagers are at this time and place in their lives that, they're making really important decisions. These are major life transitions. And as far as how our brains and our bodies respond to that, this is like, danger, danger, danger. This is like the fire alarms going off all the time. And I know that when I'm talking to teenagers about what's happening to them at school, or, they're describing to me walking into a lunchroom, navigating relationships or their sport, maybe conversations with teachers or parents about, whatever's happening for them. Many of them are really scared and they're overwhelmed and they do not feel that they have a lot of places to turn to. And I think it's very easy for us to turn around and say, oh, that's because of COVID. Everything was fine before COVID. Or, social media is a popular boogeyman. But the truth is, whatever we want to call this fear, or whatever we want to point to as a source of fear, there are a lot of wide and varied factors that are contributing to higher levels of stress and anxiety for our teens. And experiencing all of this stuff, whilst also trying to be cool and, impress your parents and your teachers and maybe get into university, these are really high stakes. And I'm often exhausted just thinking about all the things that our young people are facing. And I feel like, larger society often doesn't talk about the elephant in the room. It's as though we think, ignoring anxiety or other mental health distress is not just anxiety, as though we think ignoring it will make it better. But, spoiler alert, it will not. And it turns out, and the research supports this, that adolescents who don't learn to cope with mental health distress early on, they are much more likely to have distress into adulthood. And I find, sometimes when I think about that, I just want to swoop in, the old helicopter tactics. But unfortunately, we can't just take away all of this modern distress by swooping in and doing everything for our kids. And the reason is we're not raising our children to be children. We're raising them to be adults. But this process doesn't happen overnight. We don't have this magic wand that we can wave in the general direction of our kids and, move from the way that we parented them when they were 2 to the way that we parent them when they're 17. Remember again that our skills and their skills are changing and require changing tactics all the time. So I think the really tricky thing about anxiety is it's got this nebulous quality. And unfortunately, a lot of what we tend to tell our kids when they're experiencing anxiety and stress, a lot of that advice is not great advice. A lot of it just doesn't work. We might give our young people advice on, how we might cope with this, but we're at different ages and stages. And the way our lives looked at the age they are now is very different. I find that parents, and I'm including myself in that, we often tell them just stop it, stop thinking what you're thinking or feeling what you're feeling, um, as though somebody could just stop it right now because they've been told to, or squash it, or pretend it isn't here at all. Like, let's pretend there's not this extraordinary anxiety wrapped around the world right now. I mean, as though something like that is possible. Um, or maybe some of us might have a tendency to go into all the details of how things should be. But the thing is, as humans, we are not supposed to ignore our anxiety. And maybe some of you have heard some of this information before, but it turns out, that fear is actually a completely natural response when something in our environment poses a threat to our safety, our well-being, our security, or the safety, well-being, and security of those we love. And anxiety affects us on all levels. And that's one of the reasons, when I call it nebulous, it's like, well, what are we even pointing to, or what are we trying to get out of here? And we'll often give a lot of thinking strategies, and we're trying to get people to kind of problem solve their way out of anxiety. But it's not as simple as just thinking your way out of it. And one of the reasons for that is because human beings are hardwired to protect themselves and their young. So if we feel a threat to our survival, there's no amount of thinking that's going to get us out of it, because for millennia, this adaptive response has kept our species alive. And I remember hearing something one time when I was hearing somebody, talk about the evolution of anxiety. And I remember hearing somebody say that, when somebody experiences something like social exclusion, and exam stress is very similar, when we experience that, that's perceived by the brain and the body as a serious threat to survival. And the reason for that is because our ancestors, if they got kicked out of the pack or they weren't able to run as fast as the next fella, what would happen is that they really did die. Because if you weren't able to keep up, that in some senses was a threat to the entire community. So performing well academically and socially, they actually are critical to the survival of a teenager in the modern world. And our brains and our bodies respond in a very big way when we feel that we've been threatened or that our safety or security has been threatened in some way. And when we think about that, we often, kind of go into this mode of like, well, I just need to find all the answers. I need to somehow solve this. But doing well in these situations, it's not just about having all the right answers. It's not like studying for the big test. And of course, there is some thinking involved in safety responding. At a cognitive level, when we think that something is threatening or dangerous, interestingly, our thinking and reasoning brain, so that's your prefrontal cortex, is right about here, is actually required to switch off in order to let nature take over, for our brain to spend all of its resources protecting our very survival. So part of our brain, which is called the amygdala, that gets triggered when we perceive a threat. And then our prefrontal cortex will actually just go completely offline for a while. And during this time, we'll often become hyper-focused on survival. Another way of saying that is we might become fused. So whatever our mind is telling us, about what this danger is, it's, I would sometimes describe it as being like married to that idea. And whatever it is that our mind is telling us is dangerous, we're kind of stuck to it, glued to it. And we can get really blinded by some of that. And it doesn't really matter whether that makes logical sense or not, because it's like there's something in us at an evolutionary level that's determined to keep us safe, respond to this threat that our brain has perceived, because we are responding to what our amygdala is telling us to do. And exams, relationships, friendship breakups, I often think that, the adults in the room, we might realize that stuff is not physically dangerous to modern humans. But I would like for everybody to remember that we are still carrying our ancestors' evolutionary responses. And remember also that adolescence is a time of pushing the boundaries and exploring our place in the universe. And that in and of itself is, that's kind of a dangerous position to be in, because it's like removing the scaffolding or, putting the ship out to sea in kind of a test mode. Like, do we even know this is going to work? And then at an affective level, there are all these really uncomfortable feelings of apprehension and tension and uneasiness. And, that makes sense too, because simultaneously, to this thinking and feeling, we've got a lot of physiological responding that's happening. So autonomic arousal is occurring to prepare humans to neutralize whatever that threat might be. And that for us is often like a running, fighting, hiding from danger. And people experience this in lots of different ways. So, some people might, their body might sweat a lot, or they might experience this heart racing, pounding. Interestingly, there's also an impact on digestion. Some people might need to use the bathroom immediately, or digestion can also stop very suddenly. And that often feels like, if your digestion just stops suddenly, it's like this kind of like a punch in the stomach, or it's like, I remember somebody describing it to me as like that they had a bowling ball in their stomach, but really suddenly. Other people might experience rapid breathing or dry mouth. And of course, in your body in these moments, you're getting a burst of adrenaline and cortisol and norepinephrine. Some people then, because there's changes in digestion, some people might experience kind of rumbling tummy. They might get aches or pains in their muscles. Some people might experience shakiness or dizziness. And again, that's another reason why it can be difficult to pin down. Like, is this anxiety? Or, is my young person really sick? Because, gosh, that is a lot of physiological responding to have come on so suddenly. But essentially, during this fight or flight or freeze, the body's often physically getting ready to do whatever it needs to do to protect itself. So that might be increasing blood supply around the body, emptying the bowel or the bladder to make you lighter, or, like I mentioned, stopping digestion completely. And then there's also pumping oxygen to the heart to make you faster if you have to run. So when people experience these like heart palpitations and differences in their breathing, that's the body's way of working with all these changes that are happening. And again, this type of responding dates way back to our prehistoric ancestors. Their lives were way more precarious than ours in a physical sense. So they really needed for this process to happen quickly without anyone thinking or reasoning or wondering if this is actually a real threat. Am I being chased by a bear? Or is this just my leaving cert? And I say just my leaving cert in air quotes. But when there's a threat to your safety and survival, there's not really time to nip to the loo because possibly you might die in the next 30 seconds. And again, as you know, most modern humans, in Ireland anyway, aren't living with those same types of daily threats that our ancestors faced. We have different threats, and I mentioned some of them already. Could be things like social exclusion, fights with our friends, not having enough money, bullying, failing tests, boyfriends, partners, girlfriends, wives, whatever, breaking up with us, maybe parents getting separated, divorced. There's a housing crisis. There are a lot of environmental issues in the world. And despite the fact that our threats are different, our brains and our bodies still are responding in identical ways to how our ancestors' brains responded. So when we're perceiving that threat, no matter how logical this is, we are reacting in a physiological way as though we might die. The difference, of course, is that now we're not in the same type of danger, but our bodies just don't know it yet because evolution has not quite caught up. And what this might look like, from the outside, there's kind of this external responding. And I would often say, you can see the front face of the train, but you don't always know what the cargo is. And so some kids, when they start to feel like this, they might want to hide from what's scaring them. Others might try to, aggressively approach it. But interestingly, underneath some of what might sometimes look like a sullen teenager is often a very scared child. So I really want to encourage people to not let that fool you and make sure you look underneath the bonnet. So parents and teachers might sometimes see anxiety. It might look like avoidance. I'm not going to look at that thing. I'm not going to do that thing right now. Maybe it's just running away from difficult thoughts and feelings. Maybe it's procrastinating on tasks. And I think that's very hard for parents to watch. Maybe it's just not facing fears generally. And really, a young person doesn't always know exactly why they're feeling why they're feeling that way. And if you think about it, their thinking and reasoning brain, the prefrontal cortex, has been switched off to allow the amygdala to do its job. So when a person's experiencing anxiety, what they know is that they need to protect themselves in that moment. And they're probably going to do anything that they can to protect themselves from whatever it is that's scaring them. So many people experiencing anxiety just want to somehow get away from these really uncomfortable thoughts and feelings that feel very dangerous. And actually, this is quite a sensible response, because if you had a sharp, uncomfortable stone in your shoe, wouldn't you want to get rid of it? And we try to do that with anxiety and lots of our emotional responses too. And if you're in a terrifying moment, let's say, like, and you as parent, you see your child, there's something feels dangerous, you're going to want to jump in and protect your child. An example would be like if your child was about to run out in front of a car, you're just going to jump in and protect them. That's an amygdala response. You're not going to stop and give them a lecture about traffic or expressing your disappointment or, how come you didn't listen to all that stuff we talked about? You're not going to stop and wonder, where did you go wrong as a parent, for your child to do this foolish thing? So safety responding, again, it has to work, and it has to work quickly in order for our species to survive. But these types of responses, they simply don't work with emotional discomfort the same way they might work with like a stone in your shoe. And like I was mentioning before, you can't just think your way out of an anxiety-provoking situation. Neither you nor your child or any of us can just, run away or think our way out, avoid these difficult or uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. That really just doesn't work. And one of the reasons for that is because there are so many layers to anxiety and to teenage lives right now. There's so many more situational variables that we can't control, which again is very anxiety provoking for parents. And nobody can just ignore a millennia's worth of evolutionary responding that was intended to keep us alive. And there's no real thinking happening when your prefrontal cortex is switched off. And so, bear this in mind. It's really normal to have anxiety. And I don't want any of us to forget that. But at the same time as I'm saying that, that does not mean that we can't learn to respond to anxiety with more skill. And I often think, like, what's the dosage? What's the correct dosage of anxiety? Because a certain amount of anxiety actually maintains a high level of performance. I used to often say that, like, if I didn't have any anxiety, I would, turn up to work in my pajamas. Or, I mean, I really struggle to keep time or to be on time. If I didn't have any anxiety about that, I don't know that I would ever turn up for anything that I'd been scheduled to do. So a certain amount of anxiety is a good thing. But of course, and I'm sure you'll know this from all the things that I've talked about so far, is it can be a big problem too. So, what are some of the things we need to look out for? By the way, almost all the artwork in this presentation has been done by kids who have attended our art clubs. And so you'll see a lot of really cool art, and that's all been done by children and adolescents that have attended our clinics and have contributed to some of the books that Aideen was talking about at the beginning. So in the midst of all of the stress of exams and getting ready for the next stage of an adolescent's life, I think it's often quite difficult for a parent to sort of tease through, well, what's a normal amount of anxiety and what isn't? I remember my son coming home during his junior cert and telling me that, like, his junior cert results didn't define him, and school wasn't the only thing in life. And I remember thinking, oh no, that talk wasn't for you. Like you're falling over, you're so relaxed. That talk that the school just gave you, that's amazing. And I'm so glad that a lot of kids heard that. But I wanted to inject a little bit of anxiety into my kid. I'm only joking, of course, but um, it's like, but what's the right amount? And, you know, and so, some of the things that we want to watch out for, if anxiety is lasting for months or is extensively impacting on their everyday life, if they're struggling to go to school at all, if they're having frequent physical symptoms that don't appear to have a medical basis, and yet I would also say to parents and teachers, that doesn't mean that they are not experiencing that, because if you remember, like the heart beating fast, the sweating, the pains in the stomach, those are really happening, but they're often happening in the context of a misappraisal of cues. So when anxiety is problematic, you might notice your child looking for a lot of reassurance. They might be terribly upset if that reassurance is not forthcoming. Maybe you'll see them being excessively critical or negative, and that's kind of over and above. Like a lot of teenagers have some moodiness, and sometimes sleep deprivation too. But if you're noticing that they're excessively self-critical or negative about themselves, and if their fear is really impacting on family life, then it's time to take some action. And you might say, what type of action do I take? Well, first, I'm going to tell you what doesn't work. So we're going to do an experiment with this. Can I ask everybody what you're thinking about right now? Can put it in the chat if you're using the chat function, or you can just notice, what are you thinking about right now? Is it chocolate cake? Well, I want you to stop. Stop thinking about chocolate cake. Serious. Stop it. Wait a minute. What's wrong with you? I told you to stop it. Can you try harder, please? What if I begged? Asked really nicely? What if I got really frustrated and angry and started wagging my finger at you? I am not going to tell you this again. Stop thinking about chocolate cake. Did anybody do it? Were you able to? Or are you still thinking about chocolate cake? Well, here's the thing. It turns out that a lot of the things that we tell our kids to do when they're struggling with anxiety not only don't work, but they aren't even possible. So the research on thought suppression indicates that the more we try to squash our thoughts down or bury them or hide them or make them go away, the less likely that is to happen, because it's like trying not to think about chocolate cake when there's a picture of a chocolate cake in front of you. And the literature on thought suppression tells us that it is not possible to suppress your thoughts. And what I find really troublesome, and by the way, when I'm talking about this, I'm always including myself in this being troublesome. But we often don't listen to what our teenagers are telling us. We might say to them, you can't be feeling that way, or if you are, it can't be that bad. My dad used to have a saying, like, it'll be all over before you're twice married. But it just, like, if we step inside our teenage selves, the stuff that we're saying to our kids, like what we're saying to them is that they should somehow be feeling something completely different. And yet, the research tells us that that's not possible. And I feel like sometimes this is quite an arrogant assumption, because how could we possibly know what it's like to feel exactly what our teens are feeling in their bodies or thinking in their minds? I mean, we're not in their shoes, we're not in their bodies or their minds. And, telling people to think something different or feel something different, it doesn't work, any more than trying not to think about a chocolate cake when somebody's got a picture of a chocolate cake in front of you. Um, I mean, and I know that parents aren't, generally doing this sort of thing purposefully. But if we were doing this to like an adult partner or a colleague, we might call it gaslighting. And we often see a lot of this kind of sort of good old fashioned pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get over it. But it turns out that's not actually possible, and it doesn't work. So what does work? Okay. Um, well, one of the reasons we do all these art projects with our teens, but is how do we shape curiosity and flexibility? Sometimes we have to do that with creativity, because of course every teenager is going to be different. We also have to model bravery, and sometimes that's bravery emotionally. I think we often think that when we're adults, when we're parents, we're supposed to have all the answers. We do have all the answers. Well, we don't. Sometimes being brave is just acknowledging that, and destigmatizing help seeking. And when your teenager is talking about their feelings, well, you can model talking about your feelings too, and you can normalize making mistakes. It's to err is human, but remembering to say you're sorry when you've made a mistake, I think that's a really important human thing to do. And guess what? I mean, I'm willing to bet that you're having some feelings too. And I'm curious, and you can put this in the chat if you want. What do people do with their feelings? If you're having a really strong emotion, I remember one time I was upset, and I remember, hiding that I was crying because I didn't want my kids to see that I was crying. And we can have all sorts of discussions around the developmental appropriateness of, what you say and when you say it. But it's really important that our kids see that we have feelings too, and also that they can see what we do with them. So some of what we do with them, and in healthy ways, like it's helpful to look at this with curiosity. And it turns out when you approach things with curiosity, you actually learn a lot more than when you assume you already know all the answers. So in mindfulness, we'd often call this, a beginner's mind. And it's the very same thing with anxiety or depression or any difficult thought or emotion. Our first assumption is often, this is dangerous, get rid of it. I can't think this way or feel this way. I need this gone. And, like I don't want to have, a full blown, meltdown of my own big emotions in the middle of, let's say, giving this presentation. And yet, I think we make a lot of assumptions here around what's actually possible or what's actually helpful. And adolescents are no different, that they'll have sometimes like a ton of different emotions happening. But if we can approach anxiety as something to be explored, our relationship with it can be very different. We can learn that maybe our anxiety is just trying to keep us safe. Maybe it's not the enemy. But even if my anxiety is not the enemy, the information that my mind is giving me during a time that's really anxiety provoking, that information is not always correct. But if we can look with curiosity, we can take a peek and see, well, what is anxiety trying to tell me? And a lot of times, our anxious thoughts and feelings are actually giving us good data about the fact that there's something happening here that's important to me. Like the reason I'm having such a strong physiological response is because this is important. Like I'm, about to step into, it's like stepping off the edge of the cliff, like into the rest of my life and into so much uncertainty. So of course that's important. Of course that's going to bring about anxiety. But the thing is, during those moments, whatever our thoughts are, the thoughts are that we're having, we often take those as though they're literal truths when some of them are just thoughts. It's almost like just random words floating around my head. So I think it's often more helpful to take a step back, just notice that you're having a thought and notice the impact that those thoughts have on us. And then we can decide how we're going to act in any given moment. If we act as though every single moment is going to be an absolute disaster, then actually a lot more moments might turn out to be a bit disastrous. But that type of thinking, that's like quite fatalistic, that's often a misappraisal of a safety or a danger cue. And it's generally not likely to be a terribly effective strategy. So if we can, when we notice those, kind of danger cues coming up and our mind kind of going into overdrive, but oh my God, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? If we can instead kind of take a step back from our thoughts, and that takes practice, and the reason it takes practice is that, like, when a thought pops up in my head, it can often feel very real. So for example, when something difficult happens, maybe my mind tells me I'm an idiot, or I'm going to lose my job, or the world will end if I don't get into third level or a particular course. Like I'm going to die. My world will be over. But these are just thoughts. They may or may not be real or true. What's more helpful? Just notice that you're having those thoughts, and if you're able to take a step back, then you get to decide whether or not it makes sense to act on a particular thought. I remember one time I was given out to my teenage son, he's now 24, about how he needed to study a lot more for his mocks. And, I come from a long line of finger waggers, you need to be doing this and you need to do it right now. And I was really laying into him, definitely not my best parenting moment. And he interrupted me and said something along the lines of like, what exactly do you think is going to happen, if I don't study more? Do you think I'm going to fail my Leaving Cert completely? Do you think I am never, ever going to get a job? Do you think that's going to mean that I'm then going to go on the dole, that I'm going to become a heroin addict or something? Well, that's your anxiety. That's not mine. And right now, I'm just tired. I want you to back off. And I must admit, I was shocked. I was gobsmacked. Mostly because he was 100% right. I mean, I was being so hard on him because I was anxious about how little he was studying. And how I was behaving in that moment, it wasn't helping him. It wasn't helping him at all. And during those moments, I wasn't moving towards my values, I wasn't connected to how I could be helpful to him or how I could be supportive or even why I was giving out. Like, I mean, really, I was giving out because I really love him. I want him to have the life that he deserves and the life that he's dreamed of. But in that moment, like there's no piece of psychology that says, shouting at your child a lot is going to bring them towards a life that matters. So in that moment, what I was trying to do was reduce my own suffering and to get rid of my own difficult thoughts and uncomfortable feelings around the possibility that he might fail, that he might be bitterly disappointed, and that maybe that would mean that he wasn't going to have this life that he dreamed of. But it was so interesting to me that he could see that and I couldn't. But in those moments, and they were really stressful times, I was married to my own anxiety. And so what I want to encourage us to do is, almost like we've got a compass. And how can we learn to move towards the things that matter so that we can really support our young people better in ways that are actually supportive? So, from the outside, you might think, oh, reminding your kid to study is a good idea. But if the way that I'm doing the reminding includes shouting at a kid who's already overwhelmed, certainly in my house, that wasn't helpful. And sometimes those are really kind of like, for me, quite painful awarenesses of like, when I get anxious, I know my kids have told me this, that when I'm at the airport, that I turn into a psychopath. And, that's actually my own anxiety. Like, I'm worried we're going to miss a flight. I'm worried I'm going to lose a kid. So moving towards the things that really matter, part of it involves becoming aware of our own selves. What are our values? Like, why am I being this way in this moment? And what actually matters most? So while it's very natural to want to run, fight, or hide when things are difficult, that often moves us away from living a life that matters. That often moves us away from being the kind of a parent that we want to be. And one thing that I like to ask myself is, what's guiding my behavior in this moment? Is it a love for my child? Well, yeah, it is. But the key driver of my behavior while shouting at my child was actually my anxiety and fear. And, yes, it came from a place of love and a place of, longing for him to have the life that he deserves. And at the same time, that's not an effective strategy. So I'm going to walk everybody through a couple of strategies that do work, okay? And these are just basic tricks for switching off our amygdalas and turning back on our prefrontal cortices. So that's our thinking and reasoning brain. Because if we have our prefrontal cortexes switched on, then we're more likely to make wise decisions as parents. We're also much better placed to support our kids during these difficult times. We're also modeling for our kids, when you're in the middle of a storm, like, how do you slow it down? How do you pause? How do you drop your anchor so that you can steady your ship? So if we're in a better place for using our wise minds and our best decision-making skills, we're much better at being a safe harbor in the storm because we're anchored ourselves. So I'm going to show you this one. And I'll ask everybody, your videos are turned off. And so are your mics. So I call this being bold. And I would do this kind of an exercise with people of all ages. And I think it's sort of a funny one, because Irish kids are not often told to go out there and be bold. But basically it goes like this, B is for breathe. Your breath is your anchor. It's always with you. Nobody ever had to teach you how to breathe. You came out of the womb doing this thing. So if something difficult comes up for you, you start breathing in through your nose for 4 seconds. So let's all do that. And out through your mouth for 6. And we're going to do that 3 times, okay? In through your nose for 4, out for 6. Once more. So that's enough. In through your nose for 4, out through your mouth for 6, times a cycle of 3. That's enough to switch off your amygdala and turn back on your prefrontal cortex. So once you've done that, the O is for observe. What's happening in my mind and my body right now? What's my mind saying? Where am I feeling these sensations in my body? So maybe my mind is saying, oh my God, like this is hell. How are we going to get through this? And maybe while my mind is speaking like that, maybe I've got my heart is beating fast, or, I've got a pain in my stomach. And then L for listen. What's the most important thing right now? And, getting through this test. Maybe it's that. So the L, these are values questions. Maybe it's being kind or staying safe. Maybe it's maintaining a good relationship with our child. Maybe that's more important than being right now. And then the D is decide what's the next step we need to take to walk in the direction of what's most important to us. So that's bold. Breathe, observe, listen to what's most important, and decide what to do. So another way of turning off that amygdala, and my apologies for going through these strategies so quickly. I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. But another way of turning off the amygdala is by reactivating your prefrontal cortex, taking in information through your 5 senses. So let's all do that right now. So we can start by taking a deep breath. And just, getting comfortable wherever you are. I usually kind of wiggle around in my chair to remind myself that my chair is holding me. Even if I forgot to pay attention to it, it's still here. And then once you've kind of gotten comfy where you're sitting, just pay a bit of attention to your surroundings using your 5 senses. So if you look around the room right now, what are 5 things that you can see? And you can, just say them to yourself. Like, I see a light, I see my tea, I see my desk. And after that, after you've found your 5 things, what are 4 things that you can hear? And 3 things then that you can feel and actually feel them. Like I'm, rubbing the surface of my desk and it feels cool. Or I might, squish my scarf, touch my teacup. What are 2 things then that you can smell and actually smell them? So I can still smell my perfume. And lastly, what's one thing you can taste? I find that sometimes a tricky one where I'm thinking I can taste nothing, And then that's a good time, if you have a drink or something, take a drink. I taste chamomile tea. But the more we practice taking in information through our 5 senses when we're not anxious, the more likely we'll be able to deactivate our amygdala and reactivate our prefrontal cortex during times of high stress. And that's something you can do anywhere. The last one I'm going to walk you through is it's just a basic grounding exercise. Now, you don't have to be at the beach or anywhere special, but just push your feet down hard on the ground. So you can do that right now. And just feel the ground below you. And what you're doing there is activating your sense of touch through your feet. You can do this anywhere. But if everybody can do it right now, you're more likely to remember this little trick. I always remember this one because it's almost like you're taking up the ground, with your feet. Your feet are somehow absorbing the ground. And with that act, we're grounding ourselves. I find that really helpful and easy to remember. But it's also another one that your teen can do in the middle of an exam hall or almost anywhere, most of the time without anybody even knowing that they're doing it. Now, there's a lot of other kind of tips for exam time. The Action for Happiness, they put this out a few years ago. And I think people often forget to take breaks, but actually breaks are really important for our mental health, and schedule them if needs be. But everybody needs breaks to maintain their concentration and their positive mental health. And think about what are we doing, during those breaks. So giving, doing kind things for others, that makes us feel better. Relating, so, connect with your people, even if it's like a quick phone call or sending a text. Exercising is really important, taking care of your body. Awareness, we're talking a lot about awareness here tonight, and living life mindfully. I don't want to be bossed around by my own anxiety or my own fear about what's going to happen in my kid's life. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't care. I just want to be aware of how I am in each moment. Trying out new things, the more we keep learning in life, challenging ourselves, is that it turns out that's really important. It's also really good for your intellectual self. Direction, so have some goals to look forward to. Where am I steering this ship? Resilience means find ways to bounce back. So for some people that is exercise, music, relating with people. But, just thinking about what works for you, what works for your teenager. As far as emotions go, now I don't like this kind of positive, negative, you must drink a glass of sunshine every day, try to think positive. Sometimes stuff is just genuinely difficult. But one thing that the research tells us is that gratitude is actually very helpful. So, practice that I would often do is in the morning, I think of 3 things that I'm really grateful for. That's easy for me. I have 3 kids, so if I'm really feeling tired, I'm like, oh, my brain is tired this morning. I just in my mind land on each of my 3 kids, and I'm really grateful for them. And, acceptance, being comfortable with who you are, that takes time. These are things we work towards. And then meaning, can we be part of something bigger? So for some of us, that might mean, charity work or doing something in the community or in the environment. But where does our sense of meaning come from? And act towards that. I'm talking about a lot of tips and tricks and a lot of research. But the thing is, what if I told you that you already had everything you needed to live the life you wanted? And what if it was the same for your teenager? So, let your values guide your parenting journey rather than your anxiety, and model this so that your teen can see what this looks like. You're not going to go you won't go far wrong if it's your values guiding you. And remember, if you steer off course, you can just point your compass in the direction of what's most important to you again and go again. And reconnect with your child as often as you can. This is really important to remember, that reconnecting. And, try to chill out yourself. It's a really high stress time for everybody. But we can't model calm if we're not kind of minding our own self-care zones. And it's like the idea of, put your own life vest on first. And our teens might go into avoidance mode, let's say, when we're asking them to study. I think procrastination is a really tricky one. So can we scaffold study plans? Can we help our teen to organize themselves and study materials? Can we provide healthy snacks or hot chocolate or, whatever your teen needs to keep them going? And you can probably think of lots of other ways to support them during stressful times. But I remember my eldest son, he's the only one who's been through a leaving cert yet. That's why I keep referencing him. But I remember one of his teachers during his leaving cert year, and I was asking him, the teacher, for some tips, what should we be focusing on? Because I felt this was a class my child was struggling with. And the teacher told me that I should really be focusing on telling my son that he was great, that everything was going to be okay, and that I should make him hot chocolate or tea, provide some nice snacks to keep him going while he studied. Now, I looked at this man like he had 45 different heads, because that wasn't the information that I wanted. I wanted to know exactly what areas of the curriculum I should be focusing on, so I could quiz him later up and down to make sure he did well on this exam. And I suspect that this teacher must have seen my anxious perfectionism from 40 miles away. And you know what? I mean, I got a lot of good advice from my son's teachers and from the guidance counselor in the school, but actually that was the best advice that I've ever gotten from any teacher. Was that, like these acts of kindness and support were much better than me memorizing his curriculum. And within ACT, every strategy that I've been talking about is encompassed within these three pillars. So some people want to talk about rather than acceptance and commitment therapy, it's accept, connect, take action. But openness really just means being open to what's happening right now in this moment, in the here and now, and trying to accept what's here, or giving ourselves some psychological space from any thoughts or feelings or behaviors that arise that might not serve us. And it's tricky, I think, to kind of pull yourself out of that mode, because often when we're in that mode, we're in this problem solving mode of, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to fix it. You've got to do the thing. You've got to study more. You've got to, whatever. But, trying to have some acceptance and awareness around, whether or not the way I'm engaging is actually working. And of course, we can't do that if we're not in contact with this present moment. So, that's more kind of in the awareness zone, and we call this is essentially mindfulness. So we can't really engage in any effective action if we're completely out of touch with our own awareness. And in order to be mindful, one thing that's helpful, I think of like in viewing yourself from this perspective of, I mean, I would call it a continuous eye. That might not make sense to you, but it's like, I'm the narrator of my own play. I'm the scriptwriter of my own movie. I'm the author of the stories of my life and my parenting journey. And, our story right now is about supporting my teen through these difficult months. And then given all of that, can we commit to what's most important, in our values as a parent, let's say, and can we walk towards who we want to be as a parent, how we want to be as a parent, or how we just want to be in the world as a parent, supporting our teenager during difficult times. And of course, if we want to do that well, and I think this is hard too, so we have to listen without defense. I will openly acknowledge to finding that quite difficult, because I'm a person that's, a perfectionist. I like to know all the answers. I've studied the data. But that doesn't mean I can't get it wrong, and when I reflect back on that, I think actually a good scientist didn't become a good scientist by thinking they were always right. A good scientist got to be a good scientist by looking at what's happening and listening to the data. And I think it's, when we truly listen, then we can begin to create much more space, and in that space, we might find possibility, the expansion of choices for how we behave in a given moment. But that's also teaching our teenagers, much more reflective ways of being. And that allows them the room to grow into the adults that they're becoming. And if we can do all that, and I know that's a tall, these are all kind of a tall asks, but if we can, then we have established what in ACT we call psychological flexibility. And please know this is a skill that we can practice. So psychological flexibility is often considered the antidote to a whole range of psychological distress. So what we're aiming for is this ability to fully contact the present moment. So what's happening this here now? And whatever thoughts or feelings might come about for us, without defense, and without needless defense. Of course, sometimes we have to fight for our rights, but without needless defense. And then depending on what that situation affords, persisting or changing in our own behavior in the pursuit of our most important goals and values. And I like to think of like each and every single moment, we have an opportunity to move towards or away from the kind of parents we want to be for supporting our kids in these difficult moments. So if we can hold on to our values, and, I've used the metaphor of a compass, like, if we can use our values, what's most important to us as our compass, even though that's sometimes difficult or uncomfortable in the short term, if we can use our values to guide us towards who we want to be in the world, that's rarely the wrong move. If our primary motivation, is to get away from, pain, suffering, feeling vulnerable, or being scared, decreasing our own discomfort, or, maybe just decreasing our child's discomfort in a moment, just to be aware that that may not always serve our long-term goals. Even though sometimes it's like taking the stone out of your shoe, of course, that brings about relief. But we can't do that same thing with psychological suffering or with emotional distress. And when we are afraid or anxious or overwhelmed or tired, sometimes it's really hard to see that we have choices. And in the same breath as I say that, I want everybody to know that we're often most vulnerable around the parts of us that are the most precious. So, pain and purpose, they are two sides of the same coin. And values and vulnerabilities, they are poured from the same vessel. So when we're talking about ACT and this type of approach, this is about playing for keeps. So when I'm thinking about my kids, I'm on their team, I'm on their side. We are playing for, our best life, for their best life. We're playing for the life that you dreamed of in your wildest dreams. And when I think about my wildest dreams, that is not about hiding from all the things in life that have been scary or difficult. And one of the things that we know from the larger literature base on child development is that when our kids feel safe, they do more exploring. We know from the educational psychological literature and also from some of the trauma literature that when people feel safe, they also learn better and they perform better. So the best thing you can do for your kids when they're feeling overwhelmed and stressed out is actually to help them to feel safe. And please remember that, because that is true for all of us here as well. Like when we feel safe, we perform better. So tell me if you can hear this.
Not yet, Sarah.
I have to change my Zoom settings. Oh no, 1 second. This is nearly my last slide, but let me just have to stop share for 1 quick second. And here we go. Let's try it again. Thank you. Why you look so sad? Tears are in your eyes. Come on and come to me now. And don't be ashamed to cry. Let me see you through. 'Cause I've seen the dark side too. When the light falls on you and you don't know what to do, nothing you confess could make me love you less. I'll stand by you. I'll stand by you. I won't let nobody hurt you. I'll stand by you. So if you're mad, get mad. Don't hold it on the side. Come on and talk to me now. Hey there, what you got to hide? I get angry too. When I'm alone like you, when you're standing at the crossroads and you don't know which path to choose, let me come along. 'Cause even if you're wrong, I'll stand by you. I'll stand by you. Won't let nobody hurt you. I'll stand by you. Maybe even to your darkest hour, and I'll never desert you. I'll stand by you. Feeling all alone, wandering on your own. I'll stand by you. I'll stand by you. Won't let nobody hurt you. I'll stand by you. Maybe even to your darkest hour, and I'll never desert you. I'll stand by you. I'll stand by you. Won't let nobody hurt you. I'll stand by you. Maybe even to your darkest hour, and I'll never desert you. I'll stand by you. I'll stand by you. Won't let nobody hurt you. I'll stand by you. Are people still holding on to those intentions? Did you learn some things? You don't have to answer this for me. This is actually more for you. Did you learn the things that you wanted? Even in this whistle stop tour, with your head, something you want to learn. With your hands, something you'd like to be able to do. And with your heart, this for me is the one that's most important. But there's another psychologist, Kelly Wilson, and I've often heard him say, you have to act with your head and your heart. in equal parts. And, I think this is just important to like hold all these pieces together and to know like what are you playing for? And I like to use a lot of the language of, let's say gardening or sailing. And the reason for this is because, we need to fortify our ships so that they can be strong to face these stormy seas. But they also need to have a safe harbor to come home for. And I spent a lot of years in Chicago, and the Shed Aquarium is something we visited a lot. So this quote really stuck with me, that a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. And many times our job as parents, whether we're talking about exams or relationships or stress or life, our job is often to be that safe harbor and, to lead by example. And we can't do that if we're not in touch with our own selves. So, do people have questions?